Welcome back to Underground Strategy Podcast. My name is Max, and today Tony and Alessandro are up in Aberdeen on what they are calling a field excursion in air quotes, which from here in rainy Sweden mostly looks like an excuse to stare at concrete bunkers and sample the local whiskey. But I'll see it as building points toward my next field trip, hopefully somewhere with more sun. Maybe Florida, who knows. And whiskey aside, they managed to link up with Bruce, a real-life Indiana Jones who's been digging through both the Scottish countryside and the archives to separate real wartime defenses from the myths that we all heard too many times. So, Bruce, let's start with you. Who are you?
So in this case, I'm Bruce Mann. The job title is Senior Historic Environment Officer with Aberdeenshire Council. Essentially, I'm an archaeologist, part of a small team, and we cover Murray, Aberdeenshire, Aberdeen City, and Angus Council, so northeast Scotland. And we keep an eye and try and manage an all known historic environment, all the old sites, of which we have about 62,000 sites at the moment. We add about 1,000 a year.
Thanks, Bruce. Those are solid numbers and a big job. Alessandro, before we get into the weeds, why don't you jump in and set the scene from your side?
Well, I'm Alessandro Pasqua, and professionally, I'm a geographer, so I deal with geospatial maps and things like that. But obviously, I'm a friend of Tony's, and he was nice enough to bring me with him to this kind of new adventure and kind of assist him with this new discovery. And so I'm quite excited to find this and discover this. I'm very passionate about archaeology and history, so it is my kind of thing. So quite happy to be here.
Nice one, Alessandro. Sounds like you're right at home up there. And I know you got some good ones in store for Bruce. Do you want to lead the charge?
Yeah. Obviously, as I said, I'm a geographer, so location is quite, important, and especially for military strategies is key. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about, the terrain, the role that terrain plays in choosing the location, and if you know how the planners kind of determine where to build this and why.
Quite a big question. Quite a complicated one, but I will do my best. So I think the important thing to know for a start is northeast Scotland has miles and miles of low-lying sandy beaches. So at the start of the Second World War, with the threat of imminent invasion, they were seen quite rightly as prime candidates for a seaborne landing coming in. So that's beaches both to the south of Aberdeen, up north of Aberdeen, all the way to Fraserburgh on the tip, and then round into the Murray Firth as well. So there was a scramble in 1940, 1941 to put in defences. It was very much along the lines of a layered approach to try and put the Germans off of doing reconnaissance missions and everything else to go, it is a defended landscape, but also to try and delay or, if possible, stop an actual invasion. So we have a mixture between these low-lying beaches going up to then quite high, solid rock cliffs. So there's a mixture of geology along that coastline. And where this pillbox sits is effectively an active beach with a big semi-stable dune system that sits in behind it. And what you would traditionally sort of see is the first line of defense would be the anti-tank blocks, the concrete cubes running parallel to the beach. Then we seem to have barbed wire on iron poles, occasional minefields, and then this network of pillboxes sitting behind there. And they were basically designed to be covering the main landing angles with machine gun fire from them to inflict the maximum casualties going from there. We understand elements of the landscape, but we're still learning because they were never properly mapped out. Obviously, it was all restricted information at the time and was conveniently left lying around. So we still see pockets of new information coming through every so often. If you go anywhere along the coast, you'll see the anti-tank blocks everywhere. You'll see the pillboxes. We have about 250 pillboxes, something like that, recorded in the northeast. And then we'll have this mixture of perhaps one end of a beach heavily defended. When you look at it, take a step back. For the longest coastal stretches, it is this sequence of lookout towers on the slightly elevated positions and pillboxes to defend and keep an eye on the wider landscape, and then tucked back down within the terrain so that it becomes more of a hidden obstacle at that point to try and overcome. It is this layering that goes in. So we have, in that sort of rapid construction period, that initial deal with the coastline as quickly as possible. You've then got your kind of three main ports as well. So Aberdeen, Peterhead, Fraserburgh. And they were critical for the harbour installations for boats coming in and out. And things like, you got to remember that Aberdeen, Peterhead were bombed multiple times, attacked multiple times. I think Aberdeen, I've never known if this is a fact or not, and perhaps one of you listeners can confirm it, but Aberdeen was the second most attacked city in the UK in the Second World War. Peterhead, I know, was bombed 28 different times in itself. So you used to then get these rings of anti-aircraft defences and the pillboxes around the harbours. So that was then the infrastructure, was the kind of next bit to be taken care of, given in terms of stopping an invasion in itself. But in terms of the terrain, it was then taken to the next step for when you go inland. So we've got two major rivers in terms of the River Dee and the River Don that run roughly east-west, as it were, creating lines across the landscape. And they were, with only the few handful of crossing points, natural crossing points, they then became heavily defended with more pillboxes going in. We see things at the Cowie line at Stonehaven. So Stonehaven's a small town just to the south of Aberdeen. You've got the Cowie Water, a small river flowing down to it, but the valley it's in is really steep. It's almost verging in places like a gorge in terms of very steep sides. And there you have these creation of a stop line. The idea of extra thick defences of multiple interlocked pillboxes, trenches, firing positions. The pillbox designs have been altered, so normally a pillbox would be about 30 centimetre thick concrete. There, the 1 metre thick holes for any artillery shelling that they're going in. The whole idea of that was to use the geography, the terrain, to make this almost an insurmountable obstacle for as long as possible. So you go, that sort of then draws in naturally from the coast. So it's a real mix of, and quite surprising actually how complicated the terrain is in terms of the positioning of these things.
Totally. And I think especially in the sense that any kind of coastal area, it normally moves a little bit. It's not fixed, right? Like it's not a big bedrock that's coming out from the core of the earth.
If you take how active it is now, I mean, effectively since the pillboxes and that were built, sea level change has increased here by about 11 centimetres since the late 40s. So we're seeing a lot of increased coastal erosion and churning around. So that's why these things, like the one you'll see at Black Dog, isn't sitting on its original position. It is upside down and basically in reverse. The back door's now facing the sea, which when you first come upon it, what on earth is going on here? You try and work out the structure of what type it is. But it's, so it's slightly awkward. But and a lot of it is, the anti-tank blocks are sitting well below the high tide level. Is this submerged? And you've got other bits that are sort of falling into the water and becoming lost. But I guess at the time, it was a rush job to get the stuff in. And Big Sandy Beach, we'll put the stuff on the beach. And if it stays there for 6 months, that's probably the timescale they were looking at, before they were going to get invaded. These were not for the long term in that sense. I think they were very much what you can do as quickly as possible, using the local terrain and the resources where you can.
Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of obviously setting this up and establishing these kind of defense structures and stuff, can you tell us a little bit more about the manpower and resources required to build these structures and strategic defenses and stuff?
Yep. So there's the standard. There's, as with probably any national sort of initiative, there was the standards. So the War Office produced what was the Fortifications number 3, kind of the standard print and design of what these pillboxes should look like. So you got various types, there's a type 22, type 24, etc. So they came up with a blueprint of this is how you should build these things. Overseen by military engineers putting in, but using actually the local authorities and local contractors to bring the resources together and even possibly do some of the work. So it's sort of interesting. You hear third-party stories about everyone sort of chipping in and doing stuff, even though it should have been just the army doing it. But it was concrete is primarily first and foremost, and with the beaches you've got the sand and the pebbles there, so it's an aggregate concrete mixed in, creating this stuff, poured into what was wooden shuttered molds, effectively forming them. And you can still see for many of the structures anywhere in the UK, you'll be able to see the plank marks of where the shuttering was, and these structures still surviving. And then you'd be reinforced as well, so it'd be iron rebar would go into them, and for around the gun loops as well, and so on. Some of that might be recycled material and that's being gained locally. And then supplemented by sandbags covered with additional soil, rocks, whatever. That was the standard template, undertaken by the military, but using local contractors to source what they can as well. And you get a sort of a hint every so often, because sometimes they do graffiti on the stuff. There's an anti-tank block up towards Newborough that is occasionally visible, depending what the beach is doing at any given time. And I think it's a private that basically did a little cartoon when the concrete was still wet on it. And is a caricature of Churchill looking across at Hitler, who's looking out, watching a bomb about to land on his head. And underneath it, I think it's Hitler's graveyard. So you can get that sense of patriotism and sort of standing up and the army doing their stuff. But then you get the adaptations, the materials which you then get stuff that you don't quite expect. So we've got an awful lot of granite stone lying around. So you get some of the anti-tank blocks, even some of the pillboxes will get sharp granite stones placed on top, perhaps to add a bit more to them. You'll get pillboxes made from brick or brick elements, which I would think I'd be in a concrete one than a brick one if under attack, but it probably shows that it was slightly more difficult location to get the raw materials there. And then it's a case of perhaps really quickly needed something built for bricks sufficed. Then you get the oddities as well. So you've kind of got this standard modification of this is how you build it, coming from government, the War Office coming down. And then you've got your local military commanders making variations as needed. So between where we are in Aberdeen at the moment, if you go out on the road towards Afford, a little place called Tillyfury, and there's what would have been a standard, so hexagonal shaped type 22 pillbox by the side of the road, except for when you actually look at it, it's been slightly stretched and elongated. And it's been made into a loading ramp as well. So it's got this really kind of dual purpose. The books thought, well, we're defending the road, but actually we need it for this other purpose. And they've gone and done that. It is disguised from one side and really odd if you're looking at it from the other. If you go up to Moor, there's a village in northern Aberdeenshire, pillbox that overlooks the railway line there. That's made from granite stone. It's not concrete at all. Granite, perfectly capable of deflecting bullets and stopping them quite happily. Lots of random examples coming to mind, but Kintore, there's a building that overlooks what was the road crossing of the railway line, and there's a bridge across the River Donald we're talking about, and so strategically, very important location. And what they did there was the Home Guard basically modified the building into a form of a pillbox. They knocked whole gun loops through the brick walls of that building, so they then looking at firing positions of the railway crossing, and sort of reinforced the rest of it. So it looks like a normal house still, but it's been converted into a pillbox. So they were really creative as well. There was, set design, and then they go and do this other stuff as well, just to react, I guess, to what was the local need at that point.
All right, quick checkpoint. If you're finding value in this episode, leave us a review on your app. It really makes a difference. Watching on YouTube, hit that subscribe button to stay sharp. Now back to it. I mean, I'm still kind of stuck on the fact that Aberdeen was the second most bombed city in Britain during the Second World War. I would never have guessed that, not in a million years. So I definitely learned something new and important today. And while you were speaking, I kept thinking about these pillboxes. Not just as structures, but as a part of a whole economy of effort. Logistics, the sourcing, the manpower. And you actually answered a lot of what I was wondering already. But I got a two-part question for you. First, how scarce were building materials at the time? Was there any real restrictions on things like concrete, rebar, and that kind of stuff? And secondly, this might be a rookie question, but were any of these pillboxes actually fitted with fixed weapons like anti-tank guns or a mounted machine gun, or were they just firing positions meant to be used as needed?
In terms of the materials, given the volume of what we see surviving today, I don't know if there was actually a supply issue. If you look at the sections along sort of the Murray Firth coastline, there's a section that's sort of next to a modern forestry plantation on the beach around Burgh Head, etc. You look at the depth of the defensive lines there and the number of structures and everything, that suggests that actually everything was thrown at it. Now, whether that is consistent around the whole of the coastline of the UK, maybe that is a variable. Maybe they saw this as because of the nature of the beaches, it was more at risk. But I'm not aware of there being a particularly short supply of materials. Whether the moored example that I talked about being built of granite instead of concrete reflected a local variation on that, I suspect it was more because it would blend in. It'd be more camouflaged with the local buildings that are all built of granite. And in terms of loose granite blocks, stones, basically all the fields were divided through dry stone dikes, the dry stone walls. So this stuff was readily available and it would look the same as everything else that was going on. So I don't think the materials from the evidence that we see today was too limited from there. And then what was the second part again? I've gone off now on a tangent.
No, not at all. You answered it perfectly. Yeah, the second part was about weapons, whether any of these pillboxes had fixed guns or if they were mostly just protected firing positions with loopholes and that sort of thing.
We've seen both. Most seem to be protected firing positions, but there are one or two that have what would be mounting rails and so on for heavier weapons. You even get within Aberdeen along the river that there's fixed iron plates in the ground for mortar positions, etc. So you've actually got the ability to create fixed defenses for certain larger caliber weapons, I would suggest. But the rest of it seems to be reactive.
I mean, I still have to go and see the site, but from the photos and all that, it feels a little bit suicidal, right? You know, you're on the beach, guess where they're aiming those cannons? So, I mean, I'm sure they had a method, right? There must have been people mounted in trenches and this was an option, or it could have been all kinds of things. But just looking at it from those photos, it does give me a bit of the fear. You know, you're sitting there really nervous, you know?
You would be, and I think we never know how these ones will stand up to an attack because the mainland UK was never attacked. We never saw an Aberdeenshire invasion. So, but I think if we flip it on its head and go, what happened with D-Day for northern France and the Atlantic Wall there, these positions can inflict heavy casualties, but it is terrifying and it's going to be overcome because once you know where that fixed pillbox is, you're right. Everyone's going to be aiming at you. Everyone's going to be determined to get rid of you and you can become quickly isolated, quickly surrounded. And at that point, it is last-ditch defense. And the thing also that in terms of the UK, I don't think they were ever expected that they were going to repel an invasion. I think it was about delaying, waiting for if you can get the mobile infantry and armoured units to support and perhaps counterattack them, fair enough. But we see the establishment of the auxiliary units, which are the secret land army, as it were, that we're starting to learn more about here in the Northeast. And if you don't know if people are listening that don't know what these are, these were a network of selected handful local individuals who were basically volunteers that would, as soon as we were invaded, would go to ground to their hidden underground bunker. Effectively, it was a buried Anderson air raid shelter with a couple of concrete connecting tunnels. And they were to fight to the death, a guerrilla warfare. And I had a privilege of meeting one of the guys early 2000s. And he wasn't sure whether he was allowed to talk about his role even then in the early 2000s. And in terms of the secrecy, we have now one or two weapons caches that have been found, etc. But there was outside of Keith up in Murray, a small town up there, got a phone call from a farmer quite a few years back as one of his cows had fallen down through the roof of a collapsed bunker. And he was like, come and have a look at this because it's still got phosphorus grenades in place and so on. And it went out, attended and looked at this thing. And yeah, proper underground built bunker, 2 access points going in, built for the auxiliary unit. But the thing to remember is that his dad owned the farm during the Second World War. And his dad and him didn't know this thing had been built on their land. If you've got that level of detail and that level of effort going in inland, then obviously you're looking at these positions on the front line that the pillbox is going. They're there to delay, but they're not there to be stopping. Whatever's coming ashore is going to be going through you at some point, I guess. So absolutely terrifying.
Yeah. And, thinking about what these structures, why they were constructed and how do you think that we can learn something about modern military defensive strategies, thinking about, those structures from the past?
Yeah, I think obviously modern warfare is evolving quickly. The use of drones now is, if you suddenly get a very throwaway, cheap attacking system, then hard static targets comes with pros and cons to it anyway. But I think if you take a step back, I think the thing with the Second World War stuff was, mentioned at the start, is a layered defense. I think we've seen that in Ukraine, trying to stop the Russian invasion, is about long depth combinations of minefields, trenches, stuff that echoes back to First World War and before in many respects. So layering is important, and that cross reinforcement of firing lines and support, all of that is still equally applicable today. But as we touched on before, terrain is absolutely critical. We talk about the force multipliers in terms of using woodland to help create more of a barrier, the rivers, etc., and that. that is absolutely fundamental still. We could go and look at, I'll use a Roman example, Hadrian's Wall. It wasn't a nice big long straight line that they built the wall. They used those rocky crags where they could, because that made it even more of a formidable barrier. And that's what we've seen in the Northeast as well. I think if you're taking terrain, layering, those lessons, I would say that that's equally applicable to modern warfare today, but also adaptability as well in terms of what have you got around you? How can you use that quickly? And maybe that's where we're starting to perhaps see a turning point. I'm not an expert on this, but we're sort of joking about, pillboxes were these static, immobile, isolated features that could be overcome once everyone knew where they were. So maybe you need something that can pop up more quickly or gets moved more quickly. And perhaps that's where modern materials, different ways of doing things could perhaps allow that. So flexibility at that point, which was one of the big drawbacks of a fixed defense system, is static.
Yeah, no, and I think it kind of comes with the territory, right? The history of fortification would be that you could go up the way or down the way. So whether you're in a trench is still static, you just move your defense, as you mentioned, in depth. And it's that whole context of where you are and what you're doing, because you are going to repel an amphibious force landing, and that's going to put a bit of the fear of God into everyone. But also to mention, I think because Britain was a sea power at the time, that threat, as you mentioned, by sort of maybe 1941, somewhere there, it was pretty obvious at that point. Like, we're ready for it if it needs be, the auxiliary units. And for our listeners that heard Bruce speak so well about it now, and we definitely want to hear more about those case studies. We had Andy Chatterton on who wrote a little bit about this. So we'll add those fools together quite nicely. Max, I think you were going to come in on that point.
Yeah, I was just thinking, if we step back a bit to the bigger picture and how all of this ties into modern warfare, and with Ukraine being the clearest example we got at the moment. And yesterday I read in a Swedish newspaper that we are starting to rebuild fixed defensive lines again. And of course, there's some truth, if one might say so, in that thinking. Especially with the coastal defenses, it might actually make sense in certain areas. But what's different now is that we're looking at a war where there isn't any clear air superiority. And that's kind of new. We're used to seeing one side just pound fixed positions from the air, high altitude precision bombing. That's been a model for decades, right? But Ukraine's not that. And in a situation like that, those fixed lines suddenly have relevance again. You need something to slow down that advance. You have these massive wide front lines. It's not neat. It's not concentrated. And I think there is a role for rethinking fixed positions and not going full concrete and rebar like in the old days. But maybe something modular, something semi-mobile, something you can throw up quickly, move if you have to, still protective, still effective, but not static in the old sense. And for the auxiliary units, that's a favorite of mine. I think we're going to see that idea come back in modern warfare. I mean, we already know there were efforts to train stay-behind units in Ukraine before the invasion, and I'd bet there is more happening now behind the scenes, of course. Hopefully, we'd never have to see that kind of warfare, but we need to be ready for it, definitely. And honestly, what always strikes me about the British auxiliary units is how prepared they actually were. People didn't think there was a plan beyond the beaches, right? But there was. And that mindset, that quiet resilience, I think we will see more of it.
I think just on another thing in terms of the fixed defenses as well, and something that must have had an impact in the Second World War and still see today, I guess, in like Korea and that as well. That level of fixed defense, the psychological impact that has, both in terms of if it's defending you, going, oh, look, there's something there is tangible that is protecting me, and it gives that psychological boost from that point of view. There's also is meant to be acting as a deterrent as well. We can't just go there. We don't have to worry about the consequences. It is actually more planning involved and so on. So yeah, that's maybe that sort of other elements of the fixed defense side, which should be considered in a more volatile world. It gives reassurance and pause for reflection.
No, I think that's absolutely a fair point. And when you flip it and you see, it's outside maybe this discussion, but with the D-Day invasion, it was hard fighting, lots of tremendous amounts of planning to win the day and to get through it. There was no soft spot. Maybe they will be counterfactual, but not in this case.
Yeah, no. And I mean, something else in terms of the defenses that I love from the World War II that we're only just getting to grips with now is that we think of them as they became redundant late 1941-42 when it's sort of that threat receded. And certainly by, end of the war, these are redundant features, relics of a particular time period. We're actually seeing that they have been, without us realizing it, acting as coastal defenses, especially in the recent decade or so, stopping the erosion that would have been far worse. Suddenly, these things have a different purpose and have actually been continuing to serve us. And I think that's amazing. They've come back and repurposed themselves into something far more useful again. So.
Quick pause. If you're enjoying this episode, why not buy us a beer? It's the best way to keep Underground Strategy sharp and running. Hit undergroundstrategy.com/support to fuel the mission. Cheers to you. Let's get back into it.
And as we're coming to the close, Bruce, if we have amateur archaeologists at home, enthusiasts, what would you recommend for them to see when they're up this way?
Our historic environment record talks at the top about is freely available online. You can search on World War I, World War II stuff. We have some fascinating World War I sites as well. We've got airship station remains up here, at seaplane base. But the World War II stuff, look it up, see where it is. There's been some great books written. There is one about the Cowie Line as a stop line that was written by a guy called Gordon Barclay. That is well worth reading for a local insight. And we have a fantastic maritime museum within Aberdeen City itself. But for a regimental museum, there's a Gordon Highlanders Museum as well, which is fantastic and does touch on the Northeast as well. So you've got those, but at the end of the day, I would say go and see them, go to the beaches, go and explore, because seeing these things in context, there's nothing quite like it, because suddenly you appreciate the subtleties of positioning and the subtleties of geography and terrain and how that's been considered. And anyone who comes up on that, they might go and find a random pillbox that's popped back out. I think 3 weeks ago after a storm, someone phoned me up and got the details through. There's a coil of barbed wire, but it's obviously a leftover coil of barbed wire from some of the defenses sitting and now being exposed on the beach, and it ties in to a bit further north from where you're going. But there's still stuff out there. I will also say at the start of the year, we also had a metal detectorist who recovered a live hand grenade off a beach as well. But so there's stuff to be aware of that's equally dangerous. But come up and explore. There are landscapes that are disappearing, so come and explore and see them while you can. That's my recommendation.
And what is the best way to report, findings and stuff? Like if a local archaeologist or like an amateur finds something.
Get in touch with us. Basically, it is archaeology@aberdeenshire.gov.uk. The website contact details on there. Drop us a line and we can go. Brilliant. If it is unexploded ordnance, by all means, speak to the police first, because that's what our next step will be anyway, and then the bomb disposal squad. Even if you think that someone's probably photographed a piece of contemporary graffiti that's put into one of the blocks 100 times before now, still send it through to us, because I would guarantee actually some of the stuff we've never seen before, because it's been covered by the sand, etc. It pops out. So send it through, get in contact. We're always happy to speak to everyone, to share and to learn from them as well.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure today to be with Bruce Mann, Senior Historic Environment Officer and Archaeologist at Aberdeenshire Council. It's been really fascinating, and we're looking forward to our next leg after this interview to go to the beach, and we'll be sure to add all your details into the show notes, as well as some of those contact points.
Thank you so much, Bruce, and thank you, Alessandro. And this wraps up our 3-part miniseries, Fortress Britain, about Britain's physical defenses. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back as usual next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Been a pleasure.